Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about something I've been wanting to do for a while. We're going to be talking about why more people aren't using cat poop as thermal paste to cool their CPU. Just kidding, we're going to save that for another video. But what we're really going to be talking about is, should you go with a gaming laptop or should I build my own gaming desktop? Well, me being in computers and doing this for a while, I already know if you have a laptop and a desktop with the same exact specs, the desktop is always going to give you better performance. However, I've never really tested to see what the actual differences are. Is it twice as good? Is it only 25% better? We're gonna be doing some benchmarks. We're gonna be doing gaming benchmarks as well as some gaming. And we're gonna go balls deep.
What?
To figure out exactly what the differences are between a laptop and a desktop that are spec'd exactly the same. One, obviously being portable and using laptop parts versus a desktop using full-ass desktop parts. It's going to be pretty sicko mode. So before we get started, please like and subscribe. It really helps me out. If you have any questions, please leave it in the comments below. And every video I post will be more sicko mode than the last. All right, let's get to it. Let's get down to the nitty gritty. Hide your children because this is the Acer Predator Helios 16. Now with current pricing in 2024, the Acer Predator is over $600 cheaper, which makes it a really tempting option, especially for those who are on the fence of whether they should go with a gaming laptop or build a gaming desktop. Both CPUs are i9-13900s. The laptop is going to have the HX model, which is the mobile version, while the desktop we're using to compare it to is going to be using the 13900K, which is the desktop version. The desktop version is going to be clocked at a faster speed and also be able to use about 100 more watts of power. Same number of cores and threads. Both will be utilizing an RTX 4080. However, the mobile 4080 only has 12 gigs of GDDR6 RAM versus the 16 gigs of GDDR6X RAM on the desktop. 32 gigs of DDR5 RAM. Now this laptop did come with 16 gigs. I did end up putting 2 sticks of 16 gigs to make it 32 gigabytes of RAM, which was about $100, and I already factored that into the price of the laptop. Now the desktop RAM is 5600 megahertz, so you do get faster RAM there. And both have 1 terabyte of NVMe storage. Both are really high-end PCs. You should be able to play any game at 1440p at these specs. However, we will be testing 1440p as well as 1080p when it comes to the games, just to see what the GPU differences are and the CPU differences are. And as far as expansion options go on the laptop, it does support 1 more NVMe SSD and up to 32 gigs of DDR5 RAM, which I've already maxed out. And for some reason, the battery is not secured. It's just kind of flopping around in there, but whatever. Oh, and speaking of battery life on this laptop isn't the greatest, so I do recommend you take the charger everywhere you go. And I'm gonna tell you right now, this is a pretty girthy charger. While on battery and just playing YouTube videos and putting the laptop into power save mode, I was able to get about 2.5 hours of battery life, which honestly isn't very good for a laptop, but it is a gaming laptop, so battery life is not going to be that great. Now when you compare the battery life on the desktop will last 0 seconds on battery because there is no battery. Expansion options for the desktop really depend on the motherboard you're using. This particular motherboard supports up to 128 gigs of RAM, 3 M.2 NVMe slots, and everything you should expect out of a gaming motherboard. I can keep going on, but if you want the full specs, I'll leave a link in the description. You also have to buy an external monitor, while the laptop comes with a monitor, obviously, because it's a laptop. And the display on the Acer Predator is actually pretty sharp and crisp. 1440p, 240Hz refresh rate. It is an IPS panel. I wish it was OLED, but it's still pretty good. So the main benefit of going with a laptop would be its portability factor. But I will say, I don't know if I would take this laptop into a coffee shop to get some work done, because when the fans kick on, it is so loud. I'll get close enough to where I would be using the computer and just, I mean, that's pretty loud. Like obnoxiously loud. It's loud as ballsack. Me personally, I'm not bringing this laptop with 2 jet engines into a coffee shop. I think it's a little too intense for that kind of setting. Right, Shaquille O'Neal? It's loud as ballsack, right? Honestly, this laptop is packing a lot of power. In fact, I almost feel like it's packing a little too much. And the reason why I say that is because my CPU temps in this laptop when doing benchmarks and gaming were consistently hitting 100 degrees Celsius. The only way I was able to get temps down was using a cooling pad, and even then my CPU temps were in the 90s. I never really had issues with my GPU, it was mainly my CPU temps, but it got to the point where it would crash every time I ran a game unless I used a cooling pad. So SSC, super sucky cooling. Yeah, cooling. Not really a real acronym. Cooling in the desktop, however, was actually pretty good. Even though it's a dual fan radiator and not a triple fan radiator, which I would recommend for the 13900K, the DeepCool LT520 actually did a decent job. It did hit its max temperature of 92 degrees Celsius in Cinebench, which isn't the greatest, but the 13900K is known to get really hot.
How are you beating the heat, Ollie? Swimming hole!
And speaking of Cinebench, let's go right into the Cinebench scores. The first test we ran was the GPU benchmark test, and the desktop 4080 scored 59% better than the laptop 4080. During the CPU multi-core test, the desktop 13900K scored 36% better than the mobile 13900HX. The single-core CPU benchmark was much closer. The desktop was able to beat it out by only 8%. And single-core performance is actually the most important for gaming. Next, we're going to be moving to the 3D Mark benchmark tests, starting with Firestrike Extreme. In Firestrike Extreme, there's about a 52% increase in performance when going with the desktop. Now during the TimeSpy benchmark, which is more of a CPU dependent benchmark, the desktop score was about a 45% increase over the laptop score. And if you're interested in the ray tracing scores, I did run the ray tracing benchmark called Port Royal, and the desktop did score about 48% better than the laptop. Based off just these benchmarks, you're already seeing a big difference in performance, you're seeing a big difference in heat, and when you average out the scores from these 7 benchmarks, there's about a 35% increase in performance when going with a desktop versus the laptop with the exact same components, just the mobile versions of them. But anyways, now let's move on to actual gaming. The first game I ran was Shadow of the Tomb Raider, 1440p ultra settings with ray tracing on. And we're gonna have ray tracing on because let's be honest, when you're paying this much for a desktop or a laptop, you're expecting to utilize ray tracing in higher resolutions. So at 1440p, the desktop beat the laptop out by about 72%. That's pretty crazy. Now by no means are the laptop FPS numbers bad. 144, 109, 67, that's honestly pretty great. The desktop though is just so much better at 248, 166, and 133. At 1080p Ultra, the scores get a little closer, and that's because there isn't as big of a gap in performance when it comes to the CPUs versus both 4080 GPUs in both systems. So in other words, 1080p benchmarks are better to compare CPUs, while higher resolution benchmarks are better to compare GPUs. So on both systems, still great FPS, nothing to complain about, and there's about a 50% increase in FPS when going with a desktop. The next game I ran was Starfield, 1440p ultra settings, about a 31% increase in performance when it comes to the desktop, and that's average FPS. The 1% and 0.1% lows is the biggest difference, and the desktop is doubling the amount of FPS the laptop is giving you. Even though Starfield is poorly optimized, both systems can handle it no problem, but the laptop at times will give you sudden drops in FPS, the desktop will not. And moving on to 1080p, the desktop gives you about 104% better average FPS, which is just crazy.
That's crazy.
And look at your 1% and 0.1% lows on the desktop, never drops below 60. So super buttery smooth gameplay. However, the laptop still gave decent numbers for Starfield, 80, 58, 40, not too bad, but that's a huge difference between the desktop and the laptop. After that, we dabbled in some Hogwarts Legacy, 1440p ultra settings. The average FPS was actually quite close, about a 15% difference. My 1% lows were about double on the desktop. My 0.1% lows were actually very similar. Very interesting. Moving to 1080p, there was a bigger gap in performance, about a 36% increase on the desktop. However, much closer 1% and 0.1% lows. Overall, very decent scores. You shouldn't have any issues playing this game with either device you go with. The next game we ran was Cyberpunk, 1440p ultra settings with ray tracing on. Cyberpunk has been known to put a lot of stress on GPUs. Even with an RTX 4080, I was not able to average over 100 FPS. I was able to get about a 29% increase in performance when it comes to average FPS on the desktop. 98, 75, 47 is nothing to complain about though. And 76, 45, and 30 aren't bad numbers either. Moving on to 1080p, the gap increases to about 41% on the desktop, but the biggest difference is the 1% 1% and 0.1% lows. They were more than double on the desktop than the laptop. 98, 55, 30, still solid FPS, but once again, the desktop is just gonna give you smoother gameplay, no visible drops in FPS, and it's just gonna kick a lot of ass. After that, we ran some Red Dead Redemption 2, 1440p ultra settings, about a 28% increase in average FPS on the desktop. On both devices, pretty solid numbers all across the board. It seems like for Red Dead Redemption 2, 1440p is the perfect resolution on both devices. Moving on to 1080p, for some reason the laptop was giving me overheating issues. That's why my 1% and 0.1% lows dipped. The average FPS gap did get closer at about 18%, but the laptop was actually getting way too hot. It got so hot that the laptop literally caught on fire, and the only way I was able to put it out was with a used condom. Okay, maybe that was an exaggeration, but the laptop was hitting 100 degrees Celsius, and any game I tried, it kept overheating and freezing, even with the cooling pad. When I went to benchmark GTA 5, the laptop called it quits. I even gave it a couple hours to cool down, but still, any game I ran after that, it just kept freezing and overheating. Not a good look for Acer, but it's okay, I think we have enough data. So, after all this testing, after all the data, what does this all mean?
That means you're gay.
Close. From a performance aspect, desktop is always better, and we figured out exactly by how much. From a benchmark standpoint, benchmarks such as Cinebench and 3D Mark benchmarks, there was an average of a 35% increase in performance when going with the desktop with the same exact specs as a laptop. And when it came to gaming, that number went up to about 42%. So now you can figure out, okay, well, if I'm going with the mobile setup, this is how much performance I'm gonna lose, but I'm gonna be able to have a portable workstation, I'm gonna be able to use it in the coffee shop. Well, actually, I don't know. I mean, as long as you're plugged in, because if you're not plugged in, your performance is pretty ass. But as long as you have an outlet, you're good to go. So to answer the question, should I go with a gaming laptop or should I build a whole ass PC? With a laptop, you're always gonna be concerned about heat. You gotta make sure it's well ventilated. Sometimes you're gonna have to raise it up off the desk, use a cooling pad. When it comes to my opinion, I'm always going to tell you go with the desktop, whenever possible. But if you're needing something portable and a gaming laptop is necessary, just know that you're going to have this laptop plugged in at all times to get max performance. Another issue you're going to run into is heat, and my advice to you is do your research and find a laptop that has really good reviews when it comes to cooling. Obviously, I did not do my research, and this Acer Predator is not very good when it comes to cooling. Now, these are the numbers I got with this specific configuration, an RTX 4080 and an i9-13900K and the i9-13900HX in the laptop, 32 gigs of DDR5 RAM and a 1TB NVMe SSD. Other configurations may vary in performance, but the point of this video was to give you an idea of how much of a performance increase a desktop is over a laptop with the same exact specs. Oh, and last thing, one thing I forgot to mention, when I was working at Geek Squad, it seemed that the lifespan of gaming laptops was a lot less than gaming desktops because of the lack of upgradability and the fact that they generate so much heat in such a little amount of space. Over time, the wear and tear and heat that the laptop has to go through significantly decreases the lifespan of the device. Now, desktop parts, I've seen components last over 10 years, especially CPUs such as the i7-4790K. Laptops, on the other hand, I would say if you got 4 years of heavy use, that's a good amount of time, either because the laptop is already out of date to run the latest games, or the wear and tear has caused parts to fail. Now, this doesn't mean that there are exceptions. I'm sure there's going to be people in the comments that say I'm still using my Dell XPS from 2008, and yes, it can run Crysis. Good for you. I would just say the average lifespan of a gaming laptop is less than a desktop. Let me know what you guys think. Did you guys go with a gaming laptop or a gaming desktop? If you have any questions, let me know in the comments what you guys think. Are you guys trying to decide between a gaming laptop and a gaming desktop? And if you like this content, please like and subscribe. Me and my boys Klaus and Shaquille O'Neal work really hard to make sure each video we put out is more Sicko Mode than the last. And like always, have a Sicko Mode day.